afternoon. My name is Madeline B., and I'm the president of the Graduate and Professional Women's Network. I'd like to welcome you to the third installment of the 2017-2018 GP Women PCCW Speaker Series, presented today by Janet Gerhard. Janet obtained her Bachelor of Science degree in the Hotel School here at Cornell University and is a member of the President's Council of Cornell Women. She has extensive experience transforming the way organizations understand and manage customer experience. By analyzing and strategically changing how organizations interact with their customers, she helps clients redefine their growth strategy and consumer experience ecosystem to drive top-line growth and bottom-line results. She has established 2 consulting practices over the last 7 years, focusing on engaging organizations in managing customer relationships, revenue, and profit, driving curiosity across often siloed departments to better understand the customer perspective, creating a persistent and unified focus on the customer and commercial strategy, helping the organization work to optimize customer experience delivery, and supporting leaders in their role as cultural frontrunners in the transformation journey. In 2013, Janet was honored as one of HSMAI's top 25 most extraordinary minds in sales and marketing. She consults globally with a diverse client base, including automotive, business services, healthcare, hospitality, logistics, manufacturing, pharmaceutical, retail, technology, and telecommunication companies. She often partners with CEB, the world's leading member-based advisory company, through its customer experience and sales leadership councils. We are delighted to have Janet here today to tell us about her research on curiosity. Please welcome Janet with a round of applause.
We're going to start today talking about one of my favorite topics. And as we think about curiosity and what curiosity means across industries, across all of the different parts of our lives, I'm delighted to be able to share with you some of my experience. And I told the ladies as we were preparing and planning for this yesterday that my plan was to engage you in the presentations that I often been giving to the senior leaders in the technology, the pharmaceutical space across a multitude of industries, but also provide my editorial comments in regards to how did I even get to a place where hotelier class of 95 finds herself in front of all of you talking about curiosity. So as we get started, here's what we're gonna ask you to do. I want you to have a conversation at your tables and think about very specifically, how do you define curiosity today? I want you to take 2 minutes to have the conversation around how do you define curiosity? What does it mean to you? Have that conversation, I'll check back in and I'll show you a quick video. Now I want you to hold that definition, that meaning, that shared experience in your minds as we spend the next hour together.
If you are, you breathe.
You talk. If you talk,
You ask. If you ask,
you think.
if you think, you search. If you search,
You experience. If you experience,
you learn.
If you learn, you grow.
If you grow, you wish.
if you wish, you find.
And if you find, you doubt. If you doubt, you question.
If you question, you understand. And if you understand, you know. If you know, you want to know more.
And if you want to know more,
You are alive.
So as we think about this language of curiosity and this idea of high performance and what we talk about in regards to curiosity, I'm going to come down here and be with you. But as I think about this and what led me to this, we all have our definitions of curiosity. What gets interesting, though, is you start to look at the literature around curiosity. Oftentimes, people associate curiosity very specifically with IQ. And as we think about it, it is a predictor of IQ, but it is not necessarily the same as you think about IQ has a threshold. Curiosity, in some sense, has no limits. And where I have been spending time doing research is understanding what truly is curiosity, and then more importantly, how do we use that drive to know more to drive different outcomes within business today. And it gets interesting when you start to look at the science and you think about what does this look like overall, and we start to define curiosity. This is the definition that I use. And you all have your own definitions as you think about curiosity more specifically. But if we think about it, right, it's this hunger or a thirst for knowledge. But what gets interesting is we start to look at what happens in the business setting today. Oftentimes, we find that that curiosity can get pushed to the side, right? And you can think about the things that inhibit your ability to practice your curiosity, whether it's in the lab, in some of those work groups that maybe you exist, maybe it's even in some of the conversations you have with students or professors today. Well, I can tell you one of the things that we see out in the business and professional world today is that there are a lot of barriers to curiosity. And what I've been working with teams to do is how do we actually start to unleash that curiosity if you consider the fact that most organizations to say that their number one imperative is innovation. And the hypothesis that I've been working from is this simply, that curiosity is the prerequisite to creativity. And if you think about curiosity plus creativity is how we arrive to innovation. So what we're going to walk through is I'm going to share with you some of the research. I'm going to share with you some of the latest research, some of the newest stuff that we're doing today. I'm also going to be sharing with you what I'm finding in regards to interactions with organizations who are trying to actually practice curiosity in their business. I even just read recently, for those of you who are familiar with the organization SurveyMonkey, their president and CEO was talking about very specifically, he thinks that the differentiator for successful organizations moving forward will be their ability to use and apply curiosity to the benefit of their customers. So let's start with some of the science, right? And I have little kids, they're 10 and 12, and I can tell you something, as a parent, we get asked a lot of questions, right? A lot of questions. And many of you, I understand many of you are in, of course, a PhD and graduate programs where you're asking a lot of questions, right? And we think about children and their curious natures. And you even, those of you who aren't parents, probably have nieces, nephews, cousins, or others who are always asking you the question of, why? Absolutely. Why? Why is it that way? Right? And you think about children are sponges. They're sponges at early ages, and they're always asking questions. But here's the bad news when you look at this. When you look at the data and you talk about what does this look like and the science behind curiosity, what you find out very specifically is those same young children, when they're 3 and 4 years old, they will ask you hundreds of questions in a day. By the time those same students are 11, 12 years old, what's your guess on how many questions they're asking at that age? 5. Thank you for being willing to volunteer. Any other guesses?
Quarter of what you said originally.
Yeah, so as we think about maybe like a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, something along those lines. Think about it in this way. Here's where the sad news is. The sad news actually says that that number drops to almost 0. 0. And I can tell you with my 10 and 12-year-old right now, that's absolutely true. And there's impacts, right? There's reasons behind that. And a lot of the research that talks about this is in the learning environment. You can think, here we are at the beautiful Cornell University, right? And I graduated in 1995. And I remember very often standing in front of a classroom or listening in the back. What are we often hearing, of course, but we're getting lectured to. Right? And as we think about those opportunities, and maybe even at the very end of those meetings, classes, and lectures, there may be 5 minutes for questions. Right? And there's a few people who might raise their hands. Maybe. But there's a fear, oftentimes. What else do you see in regards to what inhibits questions today? Any beliefs or hypotheses that you would consider? Yes, ma'am, please. Go ahead. Absolutely, right? The fear of being wrong. Am I going to look stupid when I ask this question? Maybe they said it earlier and it will look like I wasn't paying attention. And we think about this kind of genius expectation, which is completely unfounded, right? Completely unfounded, but absolutely the fear of being wrong. What else exists? Please.
I think it's also about, maybe it shows in this research, but is it a transition that people, instead of asking questions, do the research themselves? Because if you think of like a 5-year-old, their parent is really their Google, whereas like a teenager might be able to find the information on their own without needing to ask a question.
Absolutely. So there absolutely, and we'll talk about the two types of curiosity that exist. And there is something that's like that Google effect. All of you are sitting around and someone will ask a question, you're like, let's look it up on Google to get the answer, right? Versus this idea of a thirst or hunger for knowledge that goes deeper. But there is the expectation of, hey, I should be able to probably find this research on my own. And then of course, at least in my children, there's a little bit of a, I know it all at this point anyway, so I'm not going to ask you any questions, right? Like, why would I possibly need to ask a question? I already know these things. So as we look into it and we start to think about what does this look like, most of the research today around curiosity has talked about what it looks like actually in a school setting. So you'll see there's some very interesting researchers out there. A gentleman by the name of Todd Kashdan is with Georgetown, and he's done a lot of research around curiosity in the environment of academia. And what does that look like? And how do we start to change the way that we're teaching in order to help nourish curiosity? And most of the studies that you see in regards to its positive impacts talk about our personal well-being. So it's not surprising probably to any of you, these types of numbers, right? That it talks about very specifically having an ability and a willingness to be in a social setting, having that opportunity as far as a greater meaning, certainly as far as I mentioned that predictor of intelligence overall. I love this too, and we start to think about this longer life, right? Happiness in longer life. But there hasn't been a lot of research around what does this look like in a business setting, right? We see it in the personal, but we don't necessarily see it in a business setting. So the backstory, if you will, I actually have been doing work with primarily sales teams. So as you think about growth organizations, and many of you probably don't necessarily consider yourself in sales, but you've got it wrong, right? To live, right, is basically to sell, because you are always trying to negotiate something. Whether it's one of your work partners or something else, you're always trying to negotiate, and the ability to sell is present anytime we're trying to persuade someone to change a behavior or do something for us. And as we started to look at what the research is out there, it really was all around very specifically this personal piece. But as we think about how do we take that into an organization? How do we make sure that we're doing the right things to help us grow? So we started to look at and we found the research that starts to speak to your point very specifically, these two types of curiosity, right? And you've got this diversive, right? So diversive is that Google effect, right? The right now. But then you have something that's called epistemic. Epistemic, and many of us probably have encountered people that we find highly curious. They're always asking questions. And you start to wonder, is that actually a trait or a behavior? And that's what most of the research is arguing today. Is it something that can be learned? And my backstory would tell you that I believe it is something that can be learned. As I'm working with sales teams and I'm working with leaders of those teams, what I'm finding intuitively is those organizations that are willing to take a step back and ask questions are consistently outperforming their peer teams. And you think about it, some of you, anybody ever read or know Liz Wiseman, the book Rookie Smarts? Anybody heard the book Rookie Smarts? She talks very specifically about this idea of being on a learning curve. And that many people, as they start to get into a profession or a role, they stop to drop off of the learning curve. And they start to use what's worked for them in the past as a bridge for solving problems of the future. They get a little bit complacent. And she uses the analogy, and I can tell you, as a hotelier, I'm not much of a camper, but some of you might be out there a little bit more of a camper. Anybody out here a camper? Somebody has been camping? All right, how about as a comparison, anybody who's also maybe a hiker? Anybody ever been backpacking? Right, I think the Holiday Inn is like camping, so there is no way that I'm gonna be backpacking. But she talks about very specifically, if you think about, so I'm gonna pick on this gentleman who sat up front, which of course you should know the dangers of sitting up front, right? As well as being one of the few gentlemen in the room. But as you think about very specifically this idea of going backpacking, how long does it take you to prepare and plan to go on that trip? A week. A week. So as you start to think about what you're taking with you, how much stuff are you taking with you?
A lot of stuff.
A lot of stuff when you're going backpacking? He must be strong.
You gotta have all your things.
You gotta have all of your things. All of your things. You know what you need. He goes a lot. And you think about, right, this idea of the backpacker. Now, as a comparison, some of you probably have been camping. And some of you may have been camping with a group of individuals. So if we think about this gentleman and his week, how long do you think it takes to plan a camping trip? What do you think, Beth? How long does it take to plan?
Well, I actually think camping would take less time than backpacking because camping can like make it like a hotel room outside, but backpacking you have like the weight limit and what you can physically carry, which I try and push the limit on.
Which you try to push the limit on. And you're right, like in camping, a lot of times you're like, well, just throw that in just in case we need it, right? So you pack up the car, it could take you hours to pack up the car, right? You get to that campsite location, you pull everything out, and what's the first thing you do? Realize you don't need most of it, probably, and sometimes a lot of people will just sit down and relax, right? Because we've got everything we need right here. Whereas the comparison of the backpacker is potentially you don't make it to where you need to go. Maybe you do, you get to that lodge or not, but you've got everything you need here. You're agile, you're able to move more quickly, whereas in that camping site, to pack all that stuff up and take that to the next spot would be really tough. And that's what we talk about when we start to think about very specifically this idea of staying on the learning curve. Can we actually get people to feel more like backpackers, where they're exploring an area versus potentially those campers, which I think is a very interesting way to think about how organizations today are starting to actually purposely put their people on a learning curve. So if you think about it this way, they're not necessarily changing roles, but what they are doing is they're purposely giving them different responsibilities, new projects, or other things in order to create that new learning curve as they're looking at how do we continue to drive innovation, how do we continue to drive creativity within the team. So it's a fun thing to think about in regards to some very progressive senior leaders out there in thinking about not just you may stay in a role for a very long time, but you get a lot of different exposure in order to keep you on that learning curve. So as we walk into this, here's where the bad news kind of comes in though, as we start to talk about what does curiosity look like at work. And this study is a couple of years old now, but you can see the statistics in regards to employees speaking to what they believe to be barriers around curiosity at work. And what gets even more interesting is when you look at senior leaders will say, oh my gosh, we have an open door policy. You can absolutely ask me any question. About 70% of senior leaders would say that. When you ask their employees, their perception on that, only a third would agree. Only a third would agree. And they're talking about very specifically that they face barriers to asking questions, right? And they also find that, generating new ideas is important, but do we actually provide the space and time for individuals to do that? And oftentimes the answer that I'm hearing from many of the organizations I'm working with today is no. And if you go even deeper, we talk about this idea of an engagement crisis. And this, for me, coming out of employee engagement research, I think is one of the more depressing statistics out there today. And it's this idea of how engaged our employees. And as you think about, many of you are starting to apply for jobs and thinking about that, you're going to run across a whole crop of people who are not necessarily thrilled with what they do. Right? Not necessarily thrilled with what they do. And in fact, you'll be lucky to find a third of your cohorts actively engaged. So as you think about coming into that environment and what does that look like for you, bringing all this new energy and possibly, hopefully, some curiosity, this is the type of stuff that they're working on. And if you think about this idea of actively engaged employees, are the ones that are more likely to leave. So as we think about this, I really think about it as a crisis, quite honestly. So a lot of leaders today are really focused on how do we start to stem this tide? How do we start to drive new thinking? So as we think about hiring for curiosity, a lot of the tools out there today, if you were to go look up some of the research, it talks very specifically about curiosity as an extrinsic, right? It's I'm open to new ideas, I'm willing to meet new people, which I don't think is enough. I don't think that's enough. I think curiosity goes beyond just social norms. It goes beyond that willingness to expose yourself to new ideas. But to your point in the back there, the willingness to actually dig deeper, right? To really explore a topic. So as we look at this and we talk about what does this look like, I mentioned the hypothesis, right? So curiosity plus creativity equals innovation. And if innovation is what all organizations strive to do today, they have to have people who are creative, but they also have to allow the space for people to be curious. So the research started really with kind of a hunch. I was seeing over and over again that the teams that were more successful seemed to ask more questions. They seemed to dig deeper into questions. They actually didn't always ask why specifically, but they certainly questioned how things were done. And oftentimes they did use why as well. And the idea behind it was, let's go out and look and see what we can find in regards to curiosity in the business setting. It really didn't exist. It really didn't exist. So we got hooked up with a gentleman many of you may not have encountered, but he was here for a time, a gentleman by the name of Professor Jeffrey Hancock. He's actually at Stanford in their communications department today, but he actually started his career here at Cornell University. He has a TED Talk out there that talks very specifically about mostly false, if you will, reviews online. Can you tell the fakes versus the real reviews online? And we said, would it be possible to actually, instead of doing a straight test, a self-report, could we actually use an individual's language to get a measure for their curiosity? So we started our experiments using some beta companies very specifically around these measures of curiosity that exist and transitioning it into the NLP, which has been a really, really interesting learning perspective. We also are finding that individuals who are more curious will actually use pronouns in different ways. They'll talk about options versus activity or actions. So as we think about commercially, how do you start to apply this? You can start to think about how do we actually measure curiosity as individuals are walking into an organization? We can also start to measure how are people showing up while they're inside that organization, and more importantly, what are their managers doing to either nurture or inhibit that team's curiosity. So that's a lot of the research that we've been doing around this. And as we started to put in this, and I mentioned here kind of what our study approach has been, right? And we've been doing a lot of analysis around this, and we've been working with high-performing teams as well as all others. I will tell you that right now, all of this research does span primarily commercial teams. So as we think about all those people who sell and everybody who supports the sales effort within an organization is how we're focusing this research today. Do we have an expectation and an anticipation that we'll actually take that into the rest of the organization? We do. But as we're getting started, we've been working very specifically against those individuals who are driving growth for the teams. So I'm happy to answer more questions on the very specific research as we walk into this. Where we start to talk about what are the results and what do we see in these results very specifically, I offer just a precursor here as we think about very specifically what are the things and how do they differentiate themselves from all others. And part of this is very specifically, like I said, this idea of exploring options versus just looking at actions or activities. They also use intensifiers in a different way. as they start to communicate. So as you think about applications, not only are we using this in a test environment, but the expectation is we may be able to harvest information from social sites, from your emails at work and other places to start to identify curiosity. And the expectation is we can then start to actually do interventions with those teams that potentially are having difficulty expressing curiosity as they're working with those organizations. So that's part of what we're looking at from a commercial perspective. It goes on to talk about some of the study results and what does this look like in regards to those individuals and those teams. And of course, we talked very specifically about there's no correlation to date that we've found between age. Most people had the expectation that it was an age thing. But it wasn't an age thing, it's the tenured issue. And going back to the conversation around what happens as we get more complacent and we start to rely on our past history as we think about using that experience to help us drive new results. I'm going to take a pause here and I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. I want you to think about if you used this definition of curiosity and how you think about curiosity more broadly, where do you see yourself applying it very specifically within the last, let's call it 10 days, right? How did you express curiosity? Where would you have said you applied curiosity in your role today? Whether that's student thinking about the lab and or some of you even shared with me sometimes we find ourselves, well, that's just the way we do things around here when we get questioned why. So have that conversation. I'll check back in with you in 2 minutes. Have that conversation. Right, so I'm interested to get your feedback in regards to where you all have been practicing some curiosity. I saw a few of you kind of making faces trying to think through, like, where have I been practicing some curiosity, right? It's getting towards the end of the semester. I got a lot of things to do, just coming off Thanksgiving break, and I'm thinking about maybe the rest of the end of the year, and maybe some of you are even working on applications and others. But which one of you would be willing to share, like, where have you practiced curiosity, like, in the last 10 days-ish, let's call it, the last 10 days? Of you. She's like, I'll talk for the rest of you people. I like it.
I'm addicted to knowledge, so, I mean, constantly with absolutely everything. Like, I can't not ask more about something. So, like, I've got houseplants, so I'm on, like, houseplant groups, and I try to figure out the best way to care for them. And then in lab, I'm researching a new thing, and I just go through all of the papers, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So, like, everything in my life, like, constantly, I don't know how not to be curious because it's my default. So I'm constantly searching for knowledge, and it's exhausting at times.
So would you anticipate, if someone were to ask you, if you said, yes, I feel myself as a highly curious individual, would you volunteer that you think that's more of a trait, or do you think that's a skill that you've developed over time?
I don't know, because I've always been curious, and I think my mom instilled that in me when I was really, really young, like reading books to me and giving me books and telling me to ask questions. So I don't know, because I don't remember a time when it wasn't there. So I feel like it's a trait because it's just like breathing to me.
And as we think about it, for some of us, it's going to be more natural, right? It's going to be more natural. And I think about those of you who maybe are not right-hand dominant, right? If I asked all the rest of you who are right-hand dominant to write with your left hand, you could do it. It might be ugly, but you could do it, right? And the same thing. And so we start to think about there is a foundation, but how do we start to encourage that versus suppress it within the organizations we work? And you're very fortunate in the roles that you are today to have an opportunity to practice a lot of curiosity. The question becomes, as you leave here, though, and you're going to be surrounded by individuals who maybe don't have that same experience, what can we be doing differently to help nurture that within the teams? I'd be interested to hear another 1 or 2 examples as you think about curiosity, and maybe even a time when you felt like, wow, I actually saw it really getting inhibited recently, or not so recently, in that discussion. For sure, I'll catch both of you. Please, go ahead.
So we were actually discussing that most of us work in labs, and how theoretically we work in labs, we're like researching and we're studying for our PhDs, and it's a highly curious, innovative environment. but a lot of us were saying that we have a certain method that works for us in labs. We have an experimental flow.
Sure.
And that we refuse to change that because it has worked, and obviously if you change something, the variable changes and our results are different, etc. And so that yes, maybe we are curious, but a lot of times that's inhibited because practically constantly changing your setup or constantly changing something, it won't work.
Absolutely. And think about the application. So you're talking very specifically to efficiency. Right? So a lot of times curiosity can suffer because of efficiency, which is true regardless of where you are, right? So as you recognize that in the lab, and we had talked about that a little bit earlier last evening, like this is the way we do stuff around here, right? These are the protocols, and this has been established and is well recorded as far as how it works for us. So it happens not in the lab, but also across many, many other organizations. Jamie.
As a parent, sometimes you just have to get stuff done, and you can't be real creative about how you get it done. Dinner has to get on the table, and this has to happen. And so it really comes down to what you're saying, efficiency. Just trying to get through the week. Not a lot of creativity happens. But maybe on the weekend. So now what can we do? We've got time. We've got things we can experiment with, and I think the same thing happens in the office.
Absolutely.
That's our point. Sometimes we just have to get the jobs done. There's no really creative about it.
And you're absolutely right. And when we look at what are some of the top barriers, we talk about very specifically, one of the very top barriers, of course, is just time, right? And what does that look like from an organizational support? There isn't a lot of organizational support. And I don't mean just like a financial support, but okay, you know what? You as a work group are gonna go think about this project very specifically. And one of the things that I would offer as kind of as another crisis, if you will, is very rarely do we actually give ourselves the space to think in the business environment today. There is a lot of execution. There is not much time built into giving people the space to really think about what they're doing today. And that's one of the things we're working on as we start to consider change, right? And what does that look like as we have those conversations with senior teams? Go ahead, please, yes.
I was just going to say that sometimes you enter into this survival mode. The way I saw it more clearly was this summer. I teach a class in the summer on study skills.
Okay.
And I had some students who were taking chemistry 2020, which is like famous for being a huge filter, super hard. So they were extremely stressed out, not sleeping, and so on. And one of the things that we emphasize is the need to sleep and the need to, just calm down and really think about what do you want to do with this class or whatever. And one of them came to see me one day and said that he had, he did an all-nighter. He went to the test and he got, say, 60% or 40% or whatever. So that meant he needed to work harder and study more. I'm like, no, you need to sleep. But it can happen also in regular job, in your regular work. Because you are like focused on the tomorrow, and you never really have even time to optimize stuff that in the long run can give you that time that you're looking for.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, please go ahead.
I have a question about what you found in terms of curiosity, because we talked about how we end up on Google and we're just like clicking and searching, and I don't know if that's a form of curiosity. So have you found the difference between productive curiosity and non-productive curiosity?
What we would actually refer to is procrastination, potentially. So what you're speaking to, and we were having a conversation in regards to like sort of where the research is and where we are today, and quite honestly, this is so new. Like a lot of this research we've just taken on in the last, let's call it 6 months. But what we're not able to necessarily make a direct tie to is the curiosity, and then what do we see as behaviors. What I can make a tie to today is, as we look at curiosity and what we see in regards to performance, I'm able to make a direct correlation between performance and curiosity, but I don't necessarily have what are the behaviors in between that actually create the output of performance. The hypothesis is that's going to be a little different for everyone, right? It's going to be a little different, but can we start to think about what are some of those times when maybe our curiosity gets us in the wrong path? I think about very specifically, many of you are probably familiar with something called the Darwin Awards, right? Are you familiar with the Darwin Awards? You're laughing up front. She's laughing. You know what these are. She knows what these are. Someone who practiced curiosity and potentially, well, in the Darwin Awards, you definitely got yourself killed, right? In regards to potentially using curiosity in the wrong way. The one that always sticks to my mind is the rocket scientist who decided to strap a rocket to his vehicle, which of course did not work out very well after a 2-mile stretch of road in Phoenix turned sharply to the left. But I don't necessarily have that connection piece at this point in regards to the productivity.
If I'm understanding you, you're saying there's the curiosity as a trait, and then there might be behaviors that help translate that trait to productivity or innovation, or is that what you're trying to say?
So my belief actually is that curiosity is a learned skill. So I believe that there are individuals who are highly curious and they've been practicing it so long that that skill is second nature to them, and so it feels like a treat. But I do believe that you can actually have interceptions with those individuals and create more curiosity through direct work with them to try to drive and stimulate that. But this is part of the conversation, which is fun, right? Is a little bit of the chicken and the egg. But do I actually have the behaviors afterwards? No. What I can tell you very specifically is that kind of diversive curiosity, that Google effect, is not what we're talking about. I'm actually interested in that epistemic curiosity, that thing that keeps driving you to learn more, dig deeper, ask different types of questions, which is more ongoing than just kind of that immediacy. Yes, ma'am?
I was just going to say, so my son has ADHD, and he's super curious, but he does get lost in the weeds. And what they see is that that's a deficiency in executive function. So you cannot, the executive function implies starting a task, doing it, and completing the task. And that's what is sort of missing, yeah. So in many cases, it could be that. No, they know, of course, but.
Yeah, and we start to think about like how we're actually driving some of the interceptions, if you will, or how we're actually trying to motivate the teams. There's a couple of things we're working on. So one of the things we're working with leaders very specifically is, first of all, how do they actually, going back to that statistic where I told you 69% of leaders are like, I've got an open door policy. You can ask me any question you want. And like a third of their people would agree with that. So one of the things that we've been working with those leaders on very specifically is how do you actually express curiosity? How are you coaching your teams? And if any of you spent any time thinking about coaching versus leadership versus mentoring, there is a difference, right? And coaching is asking really good questions, and questions should not be, I was teasing saying that questions like, have you tried XYZ? Those are directions. Those are not questions, right? Those are not questions. Those are directions. But can we actually start to think about the questions we're asking our teams as part of that? Oftentimes we're baking a lot of this into very specific work projects that they're working on as well. So as we think about applicability, a lot of times I'm not necessarily sharing the study results. We're talking very specifically about how do we explore different issues in different ways. So some of you may be familiar with different brainstorming techniques. That's one of the ways that we start to think about how do we actually drive innovation, and those managers who are actually perceived more positively within their teams actually apply more innovative techniques to how they brainstorm with their groups as well. So that's another way that we're looking at how do we start to drive a different type of behavior. But unfortunately, I can't answer the question of what are the specific behaviors that we see that are after this idea of curiosity. Other questions that are kind of out there that you're thinking about, especially as you think about the application for you. Go ahead, Beth.
Well, I was just wondering, when I was working in more of a corporate setting, SOPs, standard operating procedures, were huge. Like they were corporate-wide, and it was like written down as how you do it. You were given as a new manager to review SOPs and all that. It seems like that would, this is a leading question, just like you're saying, but it seems like that would hit curiosity, but have you seen that in practice? Or have you come across these kind of SOP-oriented cultures, and is there any relationship so far in the research supporting that? Or is that like just a totally okay thing and can be not a problem if the managers are working to create new SOPs?
out of that out of their curious thinking?
All right, I'm going to answer that in a couple of different ways. So one of the things that I'm very fortunate to do is I get to work with organizations that are already fairly progressive. It's kind of like employee engagement research. If you actually do an employee engagement survey in your organization, you care about your employees more than people who don't do employee engagement surveys, and therefore you're always going to see statistically higher results within that organization versus all others, right? So like that's kind of the same thing. So in this instance, those leaders who believe in curiosity have also pulled back some of the processes. And if you think about it, right, like all the processes we see today, that pendulum has swung way too hard. And people took what was manufacturing standards and are trying to apply them across the entirety of the business, including sales, which is insane, right? Because if you think about like effectiveness versus efficiency, like standard operating procedures isn't going to be effective. It might be efficient, but you may or may not get the results you're wanting. So a lot of the organizations I'm working with today, Beth, have already pulled back some of those standard operating procedures or are looking at ways to how do we change what we measure. And can we measure different behaviors? So, you know, using an example, especially in a sales setting, a lot of people will do like, how many calls did you make today? Right? How many appointments did you have? How many presentations did you do? How many response to proposals did you get? Right? And that comes out with a certain number of wins. I think a lot of those measures are being challenged today because the work is different and what we're expecting out of our people is different. Especially as you start to, I mean, we could go on and on in regards to technology and AI and how that's influencing how we work today and some of those other things. But I think what you'll see is culturally, and I'm interested in our HR partners who are thinking about very specifically, how do we influence the culture to actually encourage curiosity within that organization versus here's the rigor of the process and what we do today. So thank you for that question. Yes?
So it seems that the two things at odds in a lot of organizations is one, like getting things done, and like, as you said, the process, and also having that open mind space to be curious. Have you found any kind of implementing maybe like an hour a week or 2 hours or like, you know, fun Fridays to be curious? I don't know. Is there value in having set aside times, or do you think that you should be curious every day?
So I think that works differently for different individuals. I will tell you from an organizational perspective, the organizations I'm working with today, we are doing an ongoing engagement with them. And think about it this way, like any training class, anything you've ever been to, the research will tell you will lose 87% of that within 30 days if you do nothing with it. So because of that, we're trying to have ongoing interactions with those teams that are really preset. But in addition to that, do we see managers who are also like, hey, you know what, I'm blocking this much of my day to think about these various projects. I think what you're also speaking to, though, is how do I clean out the noise? So you were talking about prioritization, right? What am I doing that's not driving any success, and how do I get more efficient with the time? So that's the other thing we're seeing in regards to how they're trying to deal with it. But it is an ongoing kind of prerequisite, if you will. Like if you're gonna work with me, you gotta be at least expect to see me for 180 days, because if not, you're not gonna get any change in behavior. Other questions or comments as you're thinking about this very specifically and its application for you? So I'm gonna show you one other thing as we wrap up here. And it's a favorite. As you think about, being curious, I think one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is I love various TED Talks. I've picked one here for those of you who are familiar with Adam Savage. You probably will recognize him when you see him, but I love this one as we talk about this.
One of the funny things about owning a brain is that you have no control over the things that it gathers and holds on to, the facts and the stories, and as you get older, it only gets worse. Things stick around for years sometimes before you understand why you're interested in them, before you understand their import to you. Here's 3 of mine. When Richard Feynman was a young boy in Queens, he went for a walk with his dad and his wagon and a ball. And he noticed that when he pulled the wagon, the ball went to the back of the wagon. And he asked his dad, why does the ball go to the back of the wagon? And his dad said, that's inertia. He said, what's inertia? And his dad said, inertia is the name that scientists give to the phenomenon of the ball going to the back of the wagon. But in truth, nobody really knows. Feynman went on to earn degrees at MIT, Princeton. He solved the Challenger disaster. He ended up winning the Nobel Prize in physics for his Feynman diagrams describing the movement of subatomic particles. And he credits that conversation with his father as giving him a sense that the simplest questions could carry you out to the edge of human knowledge, and that's where he wanted to play. And play he did. Now, Eratosthenes was the third librarian at the Great Library at Alexandria, and he made many contributions to science. But the one he is most remembered for began in a letter that he received as the librarian from the town of Swenen, which was south of Alexandria. The letter included this fact that stuck in Eratosthenes' mind, and the fact was that the writer said at noon, on the solstice, when he looked down this deep well, he could see his reflection at the bottom, and he could also see that his head was blocking the sun. Now, I should tell you, the idea that Christopher Columbus discovered that the world is spherical is total bull. It's not true at all. In fact, everyone who was educated understood that the world was spherical since Aristotle's time, and Aristotle had proved it with a simple observation. He noticed that every time you saw the Earth's shadow on the moon, it was circular, and the only shape that constantly creates a circular shadow is a sphere, QED, the Earth is round. But nobody knew how big it was until Eratosthenes got this letter with this fact. So he understood that the sun was directly above the city of Swenen, because looking down a well, it was a straight line all the way down the well, right past the guy's head, up to the sun. Eratosthenes knew another fact. He knew that a stick stuck in the ground in Alexandria at the same time and the same day at noon, the sun's zenith, on the solstice, the sun cast a shadow that showed it was 7.2 degrees off axis. Now, if you know the circumference of a circle, and you have 2 points on it, all you need to know is the distance between those 2 points, and you can extrapolate the circumference. 360 degrees divided by 7.2 equals 50. I know, it's a little bit of a round number, and it makes me suspicious of this story too, but it's a good story, so we'll continue with it. He needed to know the distance between Swenen and Alexandria, which is good, because Eratosthenes was good at geography. In fact, he invented the word geography. The road between Swenen and Alexandria was a road of commerce, and commerce needed to know how long it took to get there. It needed to know the exact distance, so he knew very precisely that the distance between the two cities was 500 miles. Multiply that times 50, you get 25,000, which is within 1% of the actual diameter of the Earth. He did this 2,200 years ago. Now, we live in an age where multi-billion-dollar pieces of machinery are looking for the Higgs boson. We're discovering particles that may travel faster than the speed of light, and all of these discoveries are made possible by technology that's been developed in the last few decades. But for most of human history, we had to discover these things using our eyes and our ears and our minds. Armand Fizeau was an experimental physicist in Paris. His specialty was actually refining and confirming other people's results. And this might sound like a bit of an also-ran, but in fact this is the soul of science, because there's no such thing as a fact that cannot be independently corroborated. And he was familiar with Galileo's experiments in trying to determine whether or not light had a speed. So Galileo had worked out this really wonderful experiment where he and his assistant had a lamp. Each one was holding a lamp, and Galileo would open his lamp and his assistant would open his lamp. And they got the timing down really good. They just knew their timing. And then they stood at 2 hilltops 2 miles distant. And they did the same thing on the assumption from Galileo that if light had a discernible speed, he'd notice a delay in the light coming back from his assistant's lamp. But light was too fast for Galileo. He was off by several orders of magnitude when he assumed that light was roughly 10 times as fast as the speed of sound. Fizeau was aware of this experiment. He lived in Paris, and he set up 2 experimental stations, roughly 5.5 miles distant in Paris. And he solved this problem of Galileo's, and he did it with a really relatively trivial piece of equipment. He did it with one of these. I'm going to put away the clicker for a second because I want to engage your brains in this. So this is a toothed wheel. It's got a bunch of notches and it's got a bunch of teeth. This was Fizeau's solution to sending discrete pulses of light. He put a beam behind one of these notches, and if I point a beam through this notch at a mirror 5 miles away. That beam is bouncing off the mirror and coming back to me through this notch. But something interesting happens as he spins the wheel faster. He notices that it seems like a door is starting to close on the light beam that's coming back to his eye. Why is that? It's because the pulse of light, it's not coming back through the same notch. It's actually hitting a tooth. And he spins the wheel fast enough, and he fully occludes the light. And then, based on the distance between the two stations, and the speed of his wheel, and the number of notches in the wheel, he calculates the speed of light to within 2% of its actual value. And he does this in 1849. This is what really gets me going about science. Whenever I'm having trouble understanding a concept, I go back and I research the people that discovered that concept. I look at the story of how they came to understand it. And what happens when you look at what the discoverers were thinking about when they made their discoveries is you understand that they are not so different from us. We are all bags of meat and water. We all start with the same tools. I love the idea that different branches of science are called fields of study. Most people think of science as a closed black box, and in fact, it is an open field, and we are all explorers. The people that made these discoveries just thought a little bit harder about what they were looking at, and they were a little bit more curious. And their curiosity changed the way people thought about the world, and thus it changed the world. They changed the world, and so can you. Thank you.
I leave you with that as we think about very specifically how we apply curiosity into our everyday. And one of the things that I would encourage you to consider is just, quite honestly, acknowledging when I see those instances where potentially I'm finding it being inhibited, whether it's at work, at home, or in a personal setting. But how do I start to practice and encourage? So, as this young lady talks about very specifically, it's not just a trait, but it's something that I'm always familiar with and I'm applying as I think about my growth and my thirst for knowledge. So thank you very much for your participation and attention. It is my delight to be here today and to have the opportunity to share a little time with you. Have a great afternoon and a good rest of the semester.